Sounds good. My name is Ria. I am from Washington High School, and we are going to be on the government side of today's debate. The resolution that's been placed in the chat, and I'll read it at the beginning of my speech. All right. With that, I have 7 minutes, and my time begins now. Renee and I affirm the resolution that this House prefers a non-aligned Ukraine to a Ukraine that has NATO membership. First of all, we'd like to define this round as a value round. We must prove that a world with Ukraine in NATO is worse than a world without it. And thus, our standard for this debate should be geopolitical stability. This is because NATO is an actor that affects over 30 countries, and Ukraine, being a key actor in the region, will determine the tensions around it if it has joined NATO or not. We should preserve geopolitics in order to preserve world peace and prevent an all-out war. Thus, we define this House as the world, being the world preferring in general a non-aligned Ukraine to a Ukraine with NATO membership. All right, let's move on to some background information and definitions. So non-aligned means Ukraine will not be a part of NATO and instead be an independent state as opposed to a state that has NATO membership. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is home to approximately 30 member states. The original purpose of NATO was to protect states that were previously part of the USSR or the former Soviet Union from rejoining and to protect them against any possible military invasions. And thus it is an alliance of a bunch of member states that are committed to preserving security. Secondly, since Russia was called the USSR, Russia viewed Ukraine as part of its country. And since its collapse, Russia views Ukraine as still part of its country and wants to hold onto it as tightly as it can, preventing it from Western influence. The third point is that since 2021, Russia has employed every tactic in the book to prevent Western unification with Ukraine. And if Ukraine joins NATO, it will push Russia over the edge. Which leads me to my first advantage, which is Russian aggression. The first point here is anti-Western sentiment. The president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, recently published an essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. He argues that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that Ukraine has fake borders, and the West has established an anti-Russian project to instill fear in Ukrainians. Moving forward, we can also see that Belarus and Russia announced a large-scale joint military exercise called the Allies' Resolve of 2022 near the Ukrainian border. What this means is that if Russia wanted to, it could surround Ukraine on all sides. The second point here is Russian tensions are high in the status quo. We can see that because of wanting to preserve peace in the region, Russia has sent 100,000 troops to the border of Ukraine, but hasn't yet done anything with them. When asked, the Secretary General of Defense of Russia said, "We are avoiding a war. We see no need for a war." But the very fact that there are troops there means that if Russia got mad enough, it could start a war at any time. The third point here is that Russia is angry at NATO. Russia has long resented NATO's granting membership to countries that were once part of the Soviet Union or were in its sphere of influence as members of the Warsaw Pact, which makes sense because it was literally created to oppose them. Russia's foreign minister claimed last Sunday that NATO wants to pull Ukraine into the alliance amid escalating tensions over NATO expansion and fears that, NATO may accept Ukraine. The fourth point here is NATO and Russia are currently trying to avoid conflict. Last Sunday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg reiterated that NATO would not send troops to Ukraine should Russia invade. He said, "We are focused on providing support. There is a difference between being a NATO member and being a strong and highly valued partner such as Ukraine. There's no doubt about that." And finally, the fifth point is historical precedent. In the case of a Russian strike, I'll take it at the end of this contention. In the case of a Russian strike, Putin would not be afraid to strike. In 2013, when Russia sensed that Ukraine and the West were getting too strong ties, it immediately moved to strike in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, killing 14,000 people. Let's go to the links. The first link is the Russian military. The Russian military is far more dominant and capable than Ukraine. Ukraine has only 2,000 battle tanks compared to Russia's 21,000, and it only has approximately 1/5 of Russia's military. The second point here is Ukraine's takeover. The defense secretary stated that Putin could spend any portion of his 100,000 troops to seize Ukrainian cities or significant territories or launch actions short of a full-scale invasion if it came to that. Additionally, the third point is war goes global. If Ukraine were a NATO member, the alliance would be obligated to defend it against Russia and other adversaries. This brings in more NATO countries such as France, Germany, and the United States. Thus, the first major impact is war. Russia would invade Ukraine because it would be pushed over the edge to war because of Ukraine's joining NATO. Russia is already surrounding NATO, which means one word from Putin and they can seize homes and buildings, killing millions of Ukrainians. And secondly, this creates a global war because when NATO is involved, it turns not just from a 1v1 country conflict, but to a global conflict, which could even spell the beginning of World War III, creating mass death and extinction. I'll take your POI.
As you said, for several other former USSR member states that have joined NATO, why exactly has that not pushed Russia over the edge, as you say, Ukraine joining NATO will?
That's because Ukraine has stronger ties than any other country to Russia for one of the countries that were previously in the USSR. Unlike these other countries who were already part of like the Western sphere of influence, Ukraine has a cultural, economic, and political ties to Ukraine, which is why they're so close together. That's why Putin literally wrote an essay about Ukraine and Russia, not an essay about Russia and any other country. Let's move on to the second advantage, which is Ukraine's economy. We can see that the first point here is trade reliance. Russia has complete control over all trade going in and out of Ukraine due to the strait blocking Ukraine from the rest of the world. However, right now, they're not blocking the trade from entering Ukraine, just controlling it. Right now, Russia is allowing other countries, including those in NATO, to trade with Ukraine, which is extremely important as Ukraine is currently on the verge of an economic crisis due to COVID-19 and needs that in order to survive. The second point here is oil reliance. Gazprom, an oil monopoly in Russia, is used as a tool of economic warfare because many countries rely on it. Multiple times over the year, Russia has cut Ukraine's access to gas and oil, and nothing is stopping them from doing the same if Ukraine gets on their nerves again. Ukraine relies on Russia for gas, and Hungary relies on Ukraine. Thus, if Russia harms Ukraine, it creates a domino effect of harming several countries' economies. The links is that when the plan passes, we create more Russian backlash. Russia gets mad at Ukraine from joining NATO, and they take advantage of Ukraine's economic reliance as a form of punishment. Secondly, they cut off trade from the rest of the world, closing off their ports. And thus, the impacts here are poverty and death. Without oil and gas, people have no way of driving to work, making unemployment more likely and pushing others into poverty. Additionally, Ukraine's economy will suffer from a lack of diversity, small businesses will be forced to shut down, and COVID-19 will spread even faster. For all these reasons and more, I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
All right, before I begin, can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, okay, wonderful. My name is Inbika Grover. I'm going to be the leader of opposition from GHS. My partner is Arjun Kishore, and he will be the member of opposition. Let's start by clarifying one key thing in this debate. The reason why Russia is actively threatening Ukraine in the status quo is not just because they think Ukraine is theirs. It's because they actively don't want Ukraine to join NATO, knowing that Ukraine as a part of NATO is a NATO that is essentially rendering Russia's capability to invade Ukraine useless. Don't let government misconstrue the real incentives and motivations behind Russia's actions. They're not just wanting to have a new cultural hub. They directly don't want Ukraine to have access to a coalition that is joined in its power to essentially fight against Russia. In this speech, I'm going to do a few things. First, like just the top of the shelf, didn't talk about framing, then I'm going to go down the government case, then proceed to introduce the opposition material. But first, let's start on framing. First of all, we just want to note we generally agree with this idea of geopolitical stability and world peace. Obviously, we're not evaluating this from Russia's perspective. I think we all agree on that. Okay, but let's go on to their substantive argumentation. In their first argument, they give you this example of Russia advantage, and they have advantages to this. I want to provide 5 responses here. First of all, as we're going to go on to talk about in our case, Russia has literally directly said they're doing this because they don't want Ukraine to be a part of NATO. They've already used these tactics empirically with Georgia, and this is a really important example. They said that, the reason why, my partner asked in a POI, well, why does Russia really care about Ukraine in the first place? Well, they said, it's just because of the proximity and the advantage and stuff like that. Well, what they didn't acknowledge is that other Baltic states also provided those similar advantages, and Russia, before they joined NATO, was actively invading them. When we look to Baltic states and former USSR states like Georgia, invasions ended after they joined in NATO in the first place because Russia knew they can't fight against Georgia anymore because the entirety of NATO will go up against them. Joining NATO is an incentive not to fight. But second of all, their argumentation sounds an awful lot like they want to give up and essentially admitting that, oh, Russia has a strategic advantage. There's so many troops surrounding Ukraine, so we should just leave them to fend for themselves. The entirety of their argumentation concedes that Ukraine is lost if they don't have any form of aid in the first place. We tell you that losing Ukraine is intrinsically harmful to the global order of the world. We're going to see more USSR, former Soviet states fall, and the stability of a potential ally that could actually help us mitigate Russia's climb to power fall. But third, our third response here is they said, oh, NATO isn't willing to protect against Ukraine in the status quo. Well, our response here is this is exactly why we need Ukraine's NATO membership in the first place. We recognize that being a partner isn't enough when Russia is actively training Ukraine. That's a reason why you go for OB. But our fourth response here is that, again, Russia doesn't have an incentive to attack, because here's the problem with their argumentation. They want to call for global war, but they didn't provide a single reason why Russia thinks it's a good idea for France, Germany, the United States, and virtually the entire Western order to go fight against them. I think that Putin is smart enough to know if the vast majority of the Western world with strong military capabilities is fighting against it, they're probably going to lose. That's why they don't want Ukraine to be a part of NATO, because they know they can't declare war against NATO, otherwise they'll lose. Their second argument they made was about the economy. Well, they said that, okay, Russia has this disproportionate power over Ukraine. First response, again, this is a reason why you prefer a world where Ukraine is part of NATO. This interrelies the ideology that Russia can simply cut off access to millions of people in the status quo is a reason why we need to pull Ukraine out of that situation and open up its trade. I'll talk about that more in our case. Essentially, we say taking away the power from Russia to have this access is something you uniquely get on side opposition. With that, let's move into our disadvantages. Our first argument is protection against Russia. The first layer I want to establish is that Russia is fearful of a NATO with Ukraine. Russia has issued a list of demands to the US and its NATO allies, which was literally a ban on Ukraine joining NATO. And the expansion of NATO to the former Soviet bloc violates a key imperative of Russia, which leaves them feeling insecure. This is in Putin's own words. The word insecure is really important here, because the reason why Putin doesn't want this membership is because he knows he loses his geopolitical advantage and strategic ability within that region. But furthermore, along this line of argumentation, we would say that Russia has empirically been too weak to stop NATO expansion into Central Europe and the Baltic states in the 1990s and early 2000s. They were even willing to go to war with Georgia before they joined in order to decentivize it from joining. But let us be clear. Essentially, being like a doormat for Russia and looking at wars as a sign of aggression is ignoring the actual matter of fact. We would say that Russia's signs of aggression are exactly what government is trying to make us do. They're trying to make us fear a world where Russia is taking control. That's exactly what Russia wants. But what we're saying on the comparative is that when Ukraine is a part of NATO, Russia loses out, they don't get what they want. The second layer to this argumentation is that Ukraine is simply better off with NATO protection. What the current policy of NATO is, just so we're all on the same page, is that an attack on one nation entails an attack on the entirety of NATO. That is to say, if Ukraine is somehow invaded under Russia, then virtually Russia has declared war on all of the NATO member states, which includes some of the biggest global superpowers. Nowhere in the government case do they explain to you why Russia has a unique incentive to declare war on literally dozens of nations. Russia might be able to fight against Ukraine on its own, but it certainly cannot win a war with others just from a pure military strategic standpoint. The military, quantifiably, are far, far larger. We would say that, in fact, even in their worst, let's take government at their highest ground. If there's a war between Russia and the United States, we would say that Ukraine is actually better to have them in an alliance, because Ukraine could serve a purpose similar to that of West Germany during the Cold War, because its military already has extensive experience pushing back against the Russian military thanks to the conflict in the Donbass, and NATO integration would further prove useful to use that as a strategic vantage point to further its own goals in that regard. Final layer under this argument is that Russia wants to invade Ukraine in the status quo. I think at this point, just based on the last government speak, we all agree that essentially Russia has this objective to get Ukraine in the first place. We've seen empirically through Crimea and the lack of defense within Ukraine that they're probably going to lose without things. Things like cyber attacks make it even more important to recognize those things. Insofar as that's the case, we think including Ukraine is the only way we solve this. Our second argument in this round is on diplomatic relationships. And our first layer is global stability. Tension in this region has largely increased, which has made the whole world skittish. We look at Italian elites meeting with Putin despite Italy practically begging them not to, and essentially all of this other interregional conflict. We think that's incredibly problematic. But we would say that when you have membership to NATO, you have also things like joint sanctionabilities. We've seen that empirically, NATO has issued large sanctions on Russia, which were equal to more than 100 billion US dollars. Having this sort of spending power, when Ukraine is now part of Russia, they now are also reaping those benefits. Further, we think trade would improve as a part of Ukraine. But our third argument in this round, and something that's crucially important, is stability within Ukraine. A prerequisite and ongoing requirement for membership to NATO is having a functioning democratic political system based on a market economy, fair treatment of minority populations, a commitment to resolve conflicts peacefully, and so much more. What all of this means is that in order for Ukraine to be a part of NATO, they have to adopt a democratic system. There is so much corruption in Ukraine to the point at which it is the 9th most corrupt nation in the world. NATO membership within Ukraine means it has to adopt these standards. They become more like a more democratic society we're so proud to oppose.
Hello, everyone. My name is Renee. I am the second speaker on the affirmation. I'm going to start on the negations case, and I'm going to refute their entire case, and then I'm going to go into the affirmations case. Pretty straightforward. My time is 8 minutes. I will begin it now. So let's just do an overview here. My opponent's entire case is hinged on one small detail. Russia is afraid of NATO. But here's the problem. Do you think that war is more likely in a world where NATO and Russia are currently on good terms, or when Ukraine joins the organization which Russia hates the most? Right now, there is no conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Why do you think that NATO hasn't accepted Ukraine yet? Because they want to avoid that war with Russia. My opponents have screwed over the entirety of their case because whatever they concede, no matter what, Ukraine will join, war will occur. Let's go to their responses here. They say that they don't want Ukraine to have access to a coalition that will fight Russia, and that Russia is basically scared. I have 5 major reasons why Russia is still going to go to war with Ukraine despite Ukraine joining NATO. Ukraine should not join because Russia is afraid, and when they're afraid, they are going to attack. This means that they are going to be putting everything that they have against NATO. Then, at the second point, they say that Putin knows that he'll lose his strategic utility without Ukraine. But Russia has all of the strategic ability right now. The ports, the troops that are surrounding Ukraine, they have all the power over Ukraine. They're not going to lose that. They still have that. Thirdly, Russia has great relations they don't have any relations that are good with any NATO nation, which means that because of this poor reputation, they have absolutely nothing to lose. They will go to war and prove their strength. They need to prove that they are the global superpower. They're doing everything in their power to do so. Fourthly, Russia knows that NATO will not put troops on the ground because, as my partner said in her first speech, the NATO generals said so themselves that they are not going to be putting any troops on the ground, even if Ukraine joins NATO. They're not going to help Ukraine in the event of them being defenseless. And then finally, why Russia is still going to fight on behalf of Ukraine is that Russia does not want to harm Ukraine. Russia has a major cultural connection to Ukraine. We've said this in our first speech. They want to protect Ukraine. They want to have it join as a part of Russia. This means that they're going to fight the NATO countries that they have zero ties with, that they are going to fight them because they do not want that Western influence to be a part of Ukraine. They're going to do everything in their power to have Ukraine, and this is not good. My opponents say that if there is a war between Russia and the United States, that Ukraine is better off having this alliance. But remember that right now, Russia has the advantage. If they wanted to, they could be attacking Ukraine right now. They could be cutting off those ports and throwing millions of people into poverty. They're not doing so because Ukraine has not joined NATO. US cannot get there in time to stop these issues. Russia has all the power. They say that membership with NATO means that there is going to be large sanctions put on Russia, and that is going to harm their economy. we just said in our first speech that the economy of Russia is completely interconnected with the economy of Ukraine. If we put sanctions on Russia, that is going to harm the economy of Ukraine. All of those people we put into poverty. Why are we trying to do this? And finally, they say that in order for Ukraine to be a part of NATO, they have to be democratic. They have to adhere to all these things. But right now, because they're so corrupt, there's no way that they're going to do that. That means that Ukraine is never going to be able to reap the full benefits of being a NATO member in the first place. So what is the point of even joining? Even if they're not going to get the troops, they're not going to get all the benefits, they're just joining, and that is only going to provoke Russia into attacking them. For all those reasons, it's quite clear here that Russia is still going to fight on behalf of Ukraine. They're still going to invade Ukraine and fight any NATO country that tries to oppose them. Let's go into the affirmations case. I want to do a little bit of overview here. I already touched on this a little bit, but I've said before that Russia loves Ukraine. Russia has a cultural heritage that is deeply rooted with that of Ukraine, and they will fight at all costs to have it, which means that they are going to be fighting against all of NATO, even if it means on a slight chance they will be getting Ukraine. This means that they are going to continue. They say that Russia does not want Ukraine to be a part of NATO, and that these tactics that they use in Georgia will be repeated. But Judge, Russia does not want anyone to be a part of NATO. Russia did not fight so hard for Georgia because they did not have as strong of those cultural ties that they do with Ukraine. They will do that with Ukraine. They do want to have that connection. Georgia is a completely different country. Then they said that invasions ended in Georgia because they knew that they could not fight against NATO. But in Georgia, they did not have 100,000 troops put on the border. This proves to us that Putin is 100% serious. They've said themselves that they will only invade in the event of Ukraine joining NATO. We cannot allow this. He literally wrote an essay saying that he will do so. Then they say that Ukraine has lost its power without NATO, but NATO does not want to help Ukraine. They want to avoid the war. This alone tells you something about what's going to happen when Ukraine joins. Ukraine is going to join. They're not going to be able to get all the maximum benefits of that membership, and they're going to be left defenseless against Russia. They will be invaded, their ports will be shut off, and they're not going to be able to sustain themselves. Then they say that being a NATO partner is not enough and that Ukraine needs more, but NATO literally said themselves that there is a difference between being a member and being a highly valued partner. Do you think that Ukraine, with the corruption that my opponents mentioned themselves, is going to be considered a high value member? No, they're not going to get all these benefits. The only difference is that they're actually going to be provoking Russia into global war. Then they say that there's no reason for why Russia does not want NATO to go and fight against them, that Putin is very smart and that they know that they're going to lose. They're not going to attack NATO. But judges, Russia is not as smart as y'all think. They have a lot to prove here. They have a lot to prove because they know that in the past, with the annexations of Crimea and Georgia, that they have failed. Why do you think that they're continuing to repeat their mistakes? Because this time they think that something will be different, and they are putting 100,000 troops on the border because they are willing to risk everything in order to get Ukraine. With that, they basically dropped the rest of the contention. So I want you to look back to what we've told you about how there are thousands of troops on the border, how this war is potential to go global, and that the only thing that is stopping this war from occurring is the fact that Ukraine has not already joined NATO. So why do we want that to occur? On our second contention, where we talk about Ukraine's economy, this is heavily undercovered, and it's going to be a key reason why my opponents are going to be losing this round today. The first thing that they say is that why should we prefer a world where Ukraine is a part of NATO? But I have two major reasons. First of all, Russia is going to control Ukraine's trade if they are part of NATO. This means that in the short term, you're going to be collapsing their entire economy at its most vulnerable state. And then in the long term, the entire economy, all of that money that Ukraine would have gotten is going to flow into Russia. This means that Russia is going to have more money to invest into taking over other territories. How will they accomplish all of this in saving Ukraine without troops? It's a double bind. Either my opponents say that Ukraine is controlled by Russia and that Russia takes over their economy, or they try to fight back, which they will have to do with troops and lead to more war and lead to more death. So at the end of the day, judges, let's kind of just wrap everything up and kind of oversimplify things here. The biggest impact here is war. We can all agree that. We all know that in the status quo, there is no war, there is no death. The only thing that is going to occur is if Ukraine joins NATO, that will lead to war. Then the entire world will lead to instability because NATO is a global organization. The time frame is key because Russia can invade at any time and troops are not going to get in there and stop them in time. And finally, the magnitude, we are going to be winning on saving millions of lives inside and outside of Ukraine. So for all those reasons, it's quite clear that you must be voting on behalf of the affirmation. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me? Is everybody ready? All right. My name is Arjun Shore. Hello, judge and fellow debaters. I'm Arjun Shore. As I said, I'm representing the opposition side of this motion, and I have a lot to get into, so I'm just going to hop in. Just to start, I'm going to start talking with the affirmative side of the case, moving down through their flow, and then moving into their attacks on our case, finally ending on one key idea for this debate. All right, so just to start off on this, the first argument that the affirmative makes is regarding Russia and Russia's anti-Western sentiments, the growth of high tensions, the resentment of NATO, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just a few key ideas here, Judge, that I think should be focused on. First of all is this idea that Russia is investing everything into Ukraine. And there's a few reasons why you should not buy this argument. First of all, cultural ties are never explained. In a POI earlier, I asked why Russia was particularly interested in Ukraine. They said it was because it was a USSR state, but I also noted that there were other USSR states which entered NATO and were not attacked by Russia, those notably being Estonia and Lithuania. They had no particular reason other than saying there was a significant cultural link. Now, this cultural link, to remind you, Judge, is only explained as being a former USSR state, which then means this is not an argument you can buy based on the Lithuania and Estonia evidence. If you want to know why Ukraine and why Russia is focusing on Ukraine, is because of the current status of Ukraine, Ukraine's possible membership into NATO. They already know that Lithuania and Estonia are gone and they cannot take it. So this argument that Russia will sink everything into the war, you should not buy. All right, the second thing that they make on this argument is that NATO won't, fully protect Ukraine, or that they won't, have a full membership. To be clear, Judge, in the motion, we are arguing about whether they should have NATO membership. There's no such thing as half membership. So any argument they make about, NATO them having not full NATO membership is wrong. On this point, what this inherently means is any argument that they make about NATO not protecting Ukraine is false, because NATO membership, by definition, is rested on the threat of protection. Now, why should you buy that this won't send us to war? There's numerous reasons, as we explained, but most notably, I'd point to the two examples of Lithuania and Estonia, and the fact that NATO countries along the USSR are protected, while countries like Ukraine, one not in the USSR, were actively attacked by Russia. The last argument they made on this point to defend our rebuttal that Russia wouldn't attack NATO because NATO is far more powerful is, quote, Russia isn't as smart as y'all think. And to that point, there's either two responses. First of all, we have to assume that Russia is not made up of unintelligent leaders, and they will not choose to fight a war against 30 plus of the strongest militaries in the world. Or you have to legitimately believe, as the affirmative says, that Russia isn't smart, in which case, how would they ever win a war? So either way, whatever is proven, it shows that the affirmative clearly does not understand and can clearly not prove that Russia will have any success in the war. They also point to the thousands of troops accumulating on the border. But I would note, similar with this in Crimea and all the cyber attacks that Russia is doing to Ukraine, this is in the status quo without NATO membership. You don't see thousands of troops on the borders of Lithuania and Estonia, and it is because of NATO's protection. Now, next, on this economic notion, in terms of the economy, they talk about how Russia has an incredible amount of control over the Ukrainian economy. But on this, they drop the one key argument we make, notably when they talk about oil. As the affirmative themselves said, Russia has time and time again cut off Ukraine from their oil supply, crippling the economy. Judge, this was under the status quo. Judge, this was under a world where Ukraine was not a NATO member. Why will it be different if they join NATO? First of all, you can look to the empirical example of countries that are close to Russia, that are not influenced by the Russian economy because of their NATO membership. But second of all, because of the argument we make about the strength of NATO and the fact that Russia is afraid of NATO. That proves that Russia has no interest in economic control when a country is in NATO. Now, before I move into the ops case, I want to just talk about this key idea of Russia being afraid of NATO. On this, there were two key ideas that the affirmative set. And I just want to reinforce to you, Judge, this idea that Russia is afraid of NATO. Most notably, they explicitly said one of the reasons they are putting troops around the border is because they do not want Ukraine to join NATO. Why is that? It's because they're afraid of NATO. You can look towards other USSR states joining NATO for proof of that. Now, they talk about, the op, as I said, talks about two main ideas to refute this. The idea that, quote, there is no conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is clearly not true, as we talk about cyber attacks, the numerous paramilitary attacks, as well as the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But they also argue that Russia is currently on good terms with NATO countries. This is not true. You can look towards the billions of dollars of sanctions we cite in our own cases, evidence against this, and the cyber attacks that Russia does against NATO members actively. What this proves is that Russia is scared of NATO. Russia will not attack a country within NATO, and Russia feels incentivized to be more aggressive when the country is not in NATO. Now, with this said, I'm going to move into our case. Notably, I would point out that the second argument regarding global stability goes for the large part untouched. All they say is that war is inevitable, but they never say anything beyond that, and past the point that I've proven war will not happen and that violence is occurring actively under the status quo, move forward all global stability arguments. Also, on our third point about Ukraine's own stability, again, they make a misunderstanding of the motion where they say Ukraine will never, quote, reap full benefits because they won't have full membership. Look towards the motion itself where they will have full membership. So for those reasons, carry forward our second and third contention completely and all the impacts with that. All right, now I want to go into all 5 arguments that are brought up against our first contention about Russia. First of all, they make the argument that Russia will attack out of fear. This is a ridiculous contention. It's based on the similar argument they make about Russia not being smart. Russia is afraid of what? Russia is afraid of NATO's military power. So why would Russia ever want to attack? Their fear is based on a NATO attack. So why would they provoke that? That's clearly not true. The second argument they make is that Russia has strategic basis. But Judge, I would note that the strategic basis is solely because of the lack of NATO membership. They point to the fact that Ukraine is surrounded. That's because Ukraine does not have the protection of NATO. Lithuania and Estonia are not surrounded, Judge. Lithuania and Estonia do not have the same strategic things. The next argument they make is that Russia has poor NATO relations, so they have nothing to lose. This argument also does not hold water for two main reasons. First of all, the argument about the military power, they can lose millions of troops, they can lose a war. But second of all, the economy of Russia can still be punished more, right? That's what's actively being threatened by the United States, more sanctions. The next argument they make is that NATO has no ground troops. This again is refuted by the definition of NATO membership. If Ukraine joins, then NATO would defend it. It is under the status quo that those troops aren't deployed. And the last argument they make is that Russia won't want to harm the Ukraine because of their close ties. Again, look to the paramilitary attacks, the 2013 annexation of Crimea, and their active cyber attacks. All right, Judge. As the affirmation says, the most important impact in this round is the threat of war. And I want to compare the status quo versus a NATO world. In the status quo, Russia is actively terrorizing Ukraine. Russia actively invaded Ukraine with troops. They are actively deploying troops, and they actively are harming the country. That is the world in which they are not in NATO. They are preparing for war. In a world where NATO does exist is a world where Lithuania and Estonia exist. It is a world where they are protected from Ukraine. It is a world where the 30+ strongest countries defend it. It is for this key reason, the fact that we avoid the war impact, that I strongly urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Alrighty, is everyone all set? Good. Okay, perfect. Panel, the question that undermines the majority of government's argument is this. If a war with Russia is so likely should Ukraine join NATO, why has Russia never attacked a single NATO nation who has that membership? That single question undermines the entirety of the government case, insofar as Russia and China and other global superpowers know that a key doctrine of joining NATO is that if you attack one country, you declare war on all of them. I think my opponents are simply being naive to say that Russia is stupid enough to think that, oh, if we just invade Ukraine when it's part of NATO, when Joe Biden in the status quo is already saying we're going to help protect Ukraine, that somehow that's going to mean Russia goes untouched. This characterization is a round-losing concession for the government side. I'm going to break down this debate into 3 key ideas. First, on who's most likely to have a world war. Second, on who helps the Ukrainian people. And lastly, the economy. But let's first start with the first question on who is most likely to have a world war in the first place. Arjun does a really nice, my first thing I want to say here is Arjun does a good job of explaining how their only uniqueness point in this entire debate is that Ukraine has a cultural connection to Russia. That simply didn't do the job insofar as Arjun tells you Baltic states, Georgia, all had that cultural connection to being prior Soviet Union states. Panel, it's far too late for them to give you new analysis in their next speech about why Ukraine is so special. But we would tell you to buy our empirics in this case, because even when Russia was culturally connected to places like Georgia because of its intrinsic relationship, they stopped their invasions after they joined NATO in the first place. But the second response is, again, an attack on one nation is an attack on other. Frankly, we think it's being a little bit disingenuous to say that, oh, other nations are just not going to help Ukraine even when it's part of NATO because, oh, this is just a special circumstance. But we told you that the basic level of NATO, the first thing the nations do when they sign up to be a part of NATO was to understand the doctrine. What they didn't explain was, oh, if Russia has the capability to take on the United States, well, why aren't we in a war between Russia and the United States if they think that's such a good idea in the first place? But Judge, the final thing you need to consider is that side government concedes that they do nothing to help Ukraine in the status quo. I find it problematic for them to say that, oh, there's no conflict in Ukraine when thousands of Ukrainian civilians are dying as a result of that. They have no solvency on their side of the house. They admit that Ukraine is going to fall to the whims of Russia in the first place. We would tell you, in our worst case scenario, even if there is global war, Russia is likely to be mitigated by the other member NATO states. The second question in this debate is who helps the Ukrainian people. This was grossly underdealt with by side government. We think it's far too late for them to come up with new analysis. We told you, first of all, people are dying in the status quo in Ukraine. Invasions like in Crimea, stole the lives of thousands of individuals, and there was no one there to help them. This is why NATO membership is so crucial, because not only does it increase the likelihood now Russia is at a threat, but now it enables these countries to go into Ukraine and help combat these things. But second of all, they also dropped our argument at how a prerequisite to joining NATO is to have a democratic system. That is to say, in a world where Ukraine has NATO membership is also a world where the people of Ukraine are less subject to political corruption in the first place. This means better quality of life for Ukrainian people, both from violence, but also from having a geopolitical system which values them as individuals. But the third issue in this round is on the economy. First of all, they give you this idea of interdependence. What we told you, and this goes unengaged with, is the precise reason that Russia has the ability to turn off oil for Ukrainian people is why we need to give Ukraine an alternative. All NATO states have open trade, and many member states of NATO have oil themselves. Moving that interreliance to other people, other nations is better. But second, we told you about how more sanctions against Russia as a joint NATO coalition are much more impactful. Panel, at the end of the day, you're voting with side opposition in the round because government woefully neglected our argumentation both on the probability of war, helping the Ukrainian people, and also the economy. We are so proud to stand in opposition and urge you to do the same.
All right, thank you for that speech. Once again, my name is Ria Jane, and I will be the last affirmative speaker for today's debate. What I'll be doing in this speech is I will be giving a brief overview of the entire debate, then I'll be breaking down some key negative and then affirmative arguments, and then doing some weighing analysis. Cool. With that, my time starts now. Overview, judges, the standard for this round from the day one has been geopolitical stability, and I'm going to shorten this down to 2 words. No war. This means that if we prove to you that we avoid war, we avoid death with an unaligned Ukraine versus a Ukraine with NATO, then we should win. Let's talk about, let's give an overview of this debate. Even if my opponents win their entire case, we will win. We win the uniqueness debate. We prove to you that right now there is no war in the status quo. This means that in the affirmative world, without a Ukraine joining NATO, there is no war that my opponents concede. They say, oh, thousands of Ukrainians are dying in the status quo. This is not true. Nobody is dying. We told you last Sunday, Russia literally said it has no intention of going to war with Ukraine. Nobody is dying right now. But if you believe that there is a 1% probability that joining NATO will lead to even 1 death, we should win this debate. The only impacts my opponents have is that, oh, we won't have a war because Russia is afraid of NATO. Well, guess what? We already don't have a war. This means that even in the best case, my opponents win the scenario that Russia will somehow back down. Their impact is the same exact one as ours. And instead, even then, we're going to win on probability. Even then, I'm going to tell you why war is going to happen. First of all, I'm going to address a couple major arguments that the negation makes over and over again. First of all, they say that, oh, NATO isn't going to, NATO is going to help them, and NATO is going to, NATO membership is dependent on the threat of war. But again, like I said, NATO only helps high value states. They themselves said that Ukraine is burdened by corruption. How will they be considered high value? They give you no way of explaining how they're going to transition to democratic state. They simply say that NATO is going to help them. Secondly, cultural ties. This is the thing that my opponents blow out of proportion the most. They say, oh, we have no proof that NATO and Ukraine have cultural ties, and thus Ukraine must be the same as every other member state. This is fundamentally untrue. Not only does Ukraine have cultural ties, it has economic and political ties to Russia from the very beginning. But okay, don't buy our word for it. Imagine that there are no cultural ties. We told you that literally a month ago, Putin wrote a book, an entire book on how Ukraine has fake borders and they should reunite with Russia. Putin and Russia care about Ukraine more than any other country. And that alone is direct proof that they will stop at nothing to get Ukraine back. Finally, Russia has cut off Ukraine's oil in the past temporarily. Russia doesn't want to harm Ukraine. They just want to reunite with them. This is proven by how if Russia wanted to invade Ukraine violently, they already would have. If Russia wanted to cut off their trade violently, it would have. But they've never fully harmed Ukraine because they value it. That leads me into the two reasons why the affirmative is winning this debate, why death is going to occur, and it is only probable that it occurs in the negative world. The first is that NATO and Russia currently have good ties. Less than 1 week ago, NATO stated that it would not provide support for Ukraine in the event of a Russian invasion. Ask yourself why. Why does NATO not want to provide support to Ukraine? It's because NATO wants to avoid a war with Russia. Judges, my opponent's biggest mistake is focusing too much on, oh, who's going to win the war? Even if, Russia decided to attack Ukraine, Russia will lose the war. This doesn't matter because at the end of the day, my opponents concede that there will be a war. And when there is a war, people will die and Ukraine will be caught in the crossfire. But even if you don't buy that, oh, maybe there won't be a war. The second reason we're going to win is because we win that the status quo right now is about to be pushed over the edge. Russia currently has 100,000 troops on the border, which are surrounding Ukraine. This means that no matter what, even if NATO decides that it wants to help Ukraine, it will not get there in time. This is an argument that goes conceded by my opponents. The argument that even if the United States, the biggest military power in the world, wanted to go help Ukraine, it isn't going to get there fast enough. Because right now, Ukraine is right there, one word from Putin, and bam, their houses are destroyed. Their people are killed. Just like what happened in 2013, they killed 14,000 people then, they can kill another 14,000 now. And I ask you, do you really want to take that chance? Now let's do a world v. world comparison. In the negation world, Ukraine joins NATO, Russia invades Ukraine, and NATO doesn't put troops on the ground for two reasons. Either one, Ukraine is not a high-value member of NATO, or two, the NATO general stated himself that they have no plans of putting troops on the ground. Or in the second scenario, in the other side of the double bind, NATO does put troops on the ground, which leads to inevitable war and death. In the AF world, we are the only world who can avoid death by avoiding Russian aggression, which preserves global stability in the long run. So if you want to vote for a perfect world in which there's no way that Ukraine will possibly get invaded by Russia, go ahead and vote nay. But the problem is that when a Russian invasion comes, then there will be a war with NATO. Thank you.
Great job, guys. This is a really fun debate.
Nice job, guys. Thanks for judging as well to all the judges.